Welcome to everybody joining in. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm just going to kick us off here as folks continue to stream in. Really happy to be here. Welcome all to this fabulous panel. My name is Daniel Aldana Cohen. I'm an assistant professor of sociology here at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm the director of the Sociospatial Climate Collaborative, or SC2, hosting this event and co-hosting this event series. I'm so excited to have Toby Chow, Joanna Lewis, Kevin Gallagher, and Tim Sahe here with us today, with Kate Aronoff moderating. I'll quickly say a little bit more about this event, the series that it's a part of. I'll share the plan for our panel, and then I'll introduce our moderator, Kate Aronoff, who will in turn introduce the rest of the panel. So first, we're here basically for a couple of pretty simple reasons. There can't be a Green New Deal, there can't be climate justice, probably can't even be effective decarbonization, however you want to put it, in just one country. This has to be a global discussion. And I can also say with confidence, as the son of a Guatemalan immigrant whose family was pretty badly impacted by the CIA-sponsored coup in Guatemala, that it's not always an unalloyed good when the United States shows leadership in the world. So we need to come up with cooperative forms of engagement. In particular, with regard to today, we've seen a lot of conversations about the role of China in the world. In my view, a lot of pretty concerning rhetoric from the US government that looks like build up towards the potential for a Cold War, certainly rhetoric in that direction. And so we need to do something different. We need a progressive alternative. So this panel focused on US engagement with Chinese climate politics fits in a broader set of discussions we've had on the global Green New Deal idea, where in each case we're asking the question, how should US-based Green New Dealers or other advocates of ambitious climate justice action understand, respond to, and engage with climate politics in other parts of the world? And today we'll focus again on US engagement with Chinese climate politics, progressive alternatives to Cold War posturing. The event is co-sponsored by SC2, Perry Worldhouse, whose funding has made this event possible, the McHarg Center, and Penn's Population Studies Center. So many thanks to all of them. And the series is co-organized by myself, by Billy Fleming, Thea Rio-Francos, and Kate Aronoff, who's our moderator today. So Kate Aronoff, I'll say a word about her before we done giving the plan of the panel. Kate Aronoff is a staff writer at The New Republic. Her work has appeared in The Intercept, The New York Times, The Nation, Dissent, Rolling Stone, The Guardian, among other places. She's the co-editor of Who Owns the Future? Democratic Socialism, on Democratic Socialism. She's the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, with me and a couple others. And she's the author, most recently, of Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back, which is a book that everybody should buy and read. So that's Kate. Kate will, in a second, introduce the other speakers. They will all speak for about 12 minutes. Kate will then respond to them, put a couple of questions to them, and then Kate will moderate a conversation based on the questions from the audience. During this panel, feel free to say anything you want in the chat. Just get in there and make sure you address that to speakers and panelists. If you have questions for the panelists, specific questions, put those into the Q&A bubble at the bottom of the screen. I'm sure this is nobody's first Zoom, so you'll know what I'm talking about. We will record this event. We will send the recording to everybody who's registered. We are also going to create a kind of online portfolio of content on the Global Green New Deal idea. We'll have edited, transcribed interviews with every one of these panelists and with all of our moderators. We'll have links to their work so you can dive into their ideas, dive into their perspectives. We have Dissent Magazine as a media partner. These panels will also turn into podcast episodes of Hot and Bothered, the podcast that Kate and I co-host. So with all that said, very, very excited now to hear from our super brilliant panelists, and I will pass it on to Kate, who will introduce them to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and for putting so much work into making this happen. I'm really excited for this conversation, and it feels like it could not be even an ounce more timely than it is with what's happening in Washington, which maybe we'll talk about at the end of it. But I am really just going to sort of introduce this panel, which I'm happy to say is, who I have learned probably the most from as this group of people on China and climate politics, the intersection of those things. So we have a very esteemed panel, so it'll take me a little bit to get through their bios, but I will kick that off now. So speaking first, and I'm going to introduce everyone, as Daniel said, and then we'll dive in to folks' presentations. So speaking first will be Tobita Chow, who's the founding director of Justices Global, a special project of people's action to build a just and sustainable global economy and defeat right-wing nationalism. He is a leading progressive strategist regarding the US-China relationship and the rise of xenophobia in the US. He has co-authored a number of essential texts on US engagement with Chinese climate politics, including US-China, Progressive Internationalist Strategy under China, and Trump is trying to put us on a war footing with China. It's up to the left to stop it. Next up will be Joanna Lewis, who is Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. She has 2 decades of experience working on international climate and clean energy policy with a focus on China. At Georgetown, she runs an active externally funded research program and leads several dialogues and joint study groups facilitating US-China climate change engagement. Lewis is also a faculty affiliate in the China Energy Group at the US Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. She's the author of the award-winning book, Green Innovation in China, and was a lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 5th Assessment Report. Lewis has worked for a number of governmental and non-governmental organizations, including the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, the Asia Society, and the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and has been a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University, excuse me for any mispronunciation, the Woodrow Wilson International School for Scholars, and the East-West Center. Lewis holds a master's and PhD in energy and resources from the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's degree in environmental science and policy from Duke University. After that, we'll hear from Dr. Kevin Gallagher, a professor of global development policy at Boston University, where he directs the Global Development Policy Center and its mission to advance policy relevant research for financial stability, human well-being, and the environment on a global scale. Dr. Gallagher is the author and co-author of the Case for a New Bretton Woods, Reforming Global Economic Governance for Prosperity on the Planet, the China Triangle, Latin America's China Boom, and the Fate of the Washington Consensus, Ruling Capital, Emerging Markets, and the Regulation of Cross-Border Finance, and The Dragon in the Room, China and the Future of Latin American Industrialization. Dr. Gallagher serves on the United Nations Committee for Development Policy and the Think 20 International Finance Task Force to the G20. He has been a visiting or adjunct professor at the Paul Nitze School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico, Tsinghua University in China, and the Center for State and Society in Argentina. Finally, we'll hear from Tim Sahay, who has worked over the past decade across physics, clean tech, climate adaptation, and consulting. During his physics PhD at MIT, he was part of the fossil fuel divestment movement. As the Blue Green Cities Fellow at the Charles River Watershed Program, he organized housing advocates to lobby for climate resiliency in Boston. He's worked as a consultant on projects ranging from pollution in India to energy transition in China. He is currently the Senior Policy Manager at the Green New Deal Network, a coalition of labor, climate, and environmental justice organizations growing a movement to pass national and international green policy. So without further ado, I will hand this over to Toby.
Cool, thank you. So I am going to start by talking a bit about vaccines, COVID vaccines. I will get to climate, but I think there's some important parallels between these two global challenges of the pandemic and the climate crisis. There's the need for global cooperation in both cases, and the need for changes to global rules to allow us to meet the challenge. And then in both cases, well, in the case of COVID, our failure as a global society to meet the challenge has led to the emergence of this horrifying system of vaccine apartheid. And similarly in climate, if we don't meet the challenge, we're going to end up with a global dynamic of climate apartheid. And at Justice is Global, the main campaign work that we've been engaging in since last year is around fighting for the TRIPS waiver, which is a waiver for patents on COVID medications at the World Trade Organization. And a few weeks ago, we got a big victory where the Biden administration finally agreed to support that proposal at the World Trade Organization. And we've been leading some of the direct action strategy to support that effort, which has some important lessons on the climate fight, I think. So I want to start by looking at this interesting development out of a thing called the Quad. The Quad is an anti-China alliance consisting of the US, Australia, Japan, and India. And a couple months ago, they had a major summit. And one of the outcomes of this summit was this headline says, US and Asia allies launch major vaccine drive to counter China. Whenever they talk about big international things to counter China, we should always be worried. But in this case, this proposal is at the same time both concerning, but also kind of inspiring. Why isn't this? Here we go. Okay, so this is a quick overview of this plan, this like anti-China vaccine plan. So the US got together with Japan, India, and Australia and came up with a plan to provide 1 billion doses of Johnson & Johnson vaccines to Southeast Asian countries. And this is as it says, an effort to counter Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific region, and Southeast Asia being a part of a region that all 4 countries are interested in sort of countering Chinese influence there. How is this going to work? Well, under this deal, the US and Japan will finance production. So they'll put up they'll come up with the money, the financing. The vaccines will be produced in India. And India makes sense because India is a global center of pharmaceutical manufacturing. And Australia will help to distribute the jabs across Southeast Asia. And that makes sense for something that Australia can do because Australia has strong trade relationships with across the region. There are some promising things about this plan. What it does is it combines some real strengths and assets that these different countries bring to the table. From the US, we have the technology, the Johnson & Johnson's technology. From both US and Japan, we have financing. These are both like financial centers. India is providing manufacturing capacity, and Australia is providing this assistance with distribution because of all its trade links with Southeast Asia. And so, by combining these strengths, they proposed to come up with this huge project to greatly increase vaccine manufacturing and distribution, which in principle is great. But there are some real problems with the plan. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is an anti-China plan. One problem is that, first of all, China is excluded from the plan. China obviously has a great deal to offer any proposal for international cooperation to increase vaccine manufacturing distribution. China is already by far the world leader in manufacturing vaccines and in exporting vaccines to other countries. So you could do more on any international cooperation effort by including China. There's also arguably an issue in focusing on Southeast Asia. If you were looking at where there's the most help needed in the world in dealing with COVID, you probably wouldn't start with Southeast Asia. A lot of Southeast Asian countries are dealing with the pandemic quite well already, and should get vaccine help, but maybe focusing all the billion vaccines just there isn't the right priority. It's also not true tech sharing. Under this plan, Johnson & Johnson would retain control of the technology and would probably stand to make huge amounts of money. And then finally, it's not clear that this plan is actually going to work. We're seeing right now with these weeks of this exploding COVID wave in India, the US is already failing to provide sufficient help to India right now. So it just calls into question how would even if India could get over this current wave and contribute to this plan, what is the US capacity to actually coordinate this thing? Problems with this quad vaccine plan, but in principle, it sort of points the way to what greater international cooperation could achieve, and what could we achieve by bringing different countries to the table and pooling all the different resources and assets that each country can bring. Based on that model, we could imagine what would a better version of this be that is actually global and more robust to massively scale up vaccine production and distribution, which is something we still desperately need to do. Well, first we'd incorporate the whole world, including China, including Russia, which is also exporting a lot of vaccines. And, we bring in their manufacturing capacity, also their vaccine technology. We bring in the UK, the EU, we bring in the whole world and everything that everyone has to offer. We would also make sure that we freely share all COVID technology, which is part of what the campaign for the TRIPS waiver is getting at. We would also pool all the financing that we could bring together from all countries and put that to use, rapidly increasing manufacturing for COVID vaccines. We would make sure that we are using all existing industrial capacity, but we would also invest in the creation of new industrial capacity. We would scale up industrial capacity for vaccine manufacturing. And I think in scaling up that capacity, we would maybe want to especially target parts of the world, regions and countries that currently lack that industrial capacity. Parts of the world that haven't had access to this kind of investment in the past and therefore have weak to non-existent pharmaceutical industries. And targeting those parts of the world would be important because that doesn't just increase overall global industrial capacity, but also would create a more evenly distributed, a more even distribution of that capacity, which would create a more resilient system, both globally and at the regional level, and would also be more equitable. That would address some of the great inequalities that we're seeing between global north and global south. Oops, I'm off. Okay, cool. So I think that is also a good model for thinking about what a global Green New Deal could look like. It should incorporate the whole world, including both US and China. We would freely share all clean energy technology. We would pool financial resources globally to finance rapid increase in clean energy and infrastructure clean energy manufacturing, clean energy infrastructure. We would include massive investments in new clean energy industrial capacity. And with those investments, we would especially target parts of the world that currently lack that industrial capacity for the same reasons. That would create a more resilient and more equitable system worldwide. And I'm behind, so I'm going to skip that. The US and China, when it comes to global Green New Deal, both bring significant respective strengths that need to be combined. So the US is a world leader in clean technology research and development. China, on the other hand, is by far a world leader in scaling up the production of those technologies and commercializing them, a leader in clean technology industrial capacity, right? So the US is leading doing the research. China is leading in actually making this stuff in a wide variety of clean technology sectors. The US is, world leader as a center of finance capital, so it has a lot of financial resources to contribute. And also has the world's strongest system of international alliances and ability to organize other countries in the world in joint efforts. China, meanwhile, runs the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a leading source of financing and investment in infrastructure worldwide, and in particular in the global South. So all these aspects of both countries, we can have they're like important progressive critiques of all of these aspects of both countries. And maybe we'll get into that more in Q&A. But like realistically, these are going to be important building blocks for any global Green New Deal, any new global regime of pushing clean energy investment worldwide, and in particular into the countries in the global South that need it the most if we're going to beat the climate crisis. Okay, so here's some of the aspects that I think we should look for in a global Green New Deal. So this all requires international cooperation. It requires cooperation between the US and China above all. It also requires a change to global rules. In particular, the need to freely share clean energy technology and to increase investment in new industrial capacity. That requires some global reforms to the existing rules-based order that the US has been leading in upholding. We need to weaken or create alternatives to the existing intellectual property rights regime, as we've seen in the fight over the TRIPS waiver for COVID vaccines. That has been a major part of the fight. We also need to weaken or abolish rules and norms that block countries from engaging in industrial policy. This has been, under the neoliberal status quo, a huge problem for the global South in particular. And so these are two changes we need to make to global rules. These also get at two key economic grievances that the US has had against China. The US, and these are leaders in both parties, have complained first that China violates intellectual property rights. They're particularly worried about the intellectual property of US transnational corporations. And they also complain that China is engaging in, quote, unfair trade practices, by which they are referring to China's extremely successful use of industrial policy. So these are two major parts of the case against China that US leaders make in the economic arena. And we can see that the changes that we need to make to the global economic rules for this, in order to meet the climate crisis, are directly in contradiction to the commitments that US leaders make when they make these economic grievances against China. So we need greater US-China cooperation in order to beat the climate crisis. But as we can make progress to making the necessary rules to, as we make progress towards making the necessary changes to global rules in order to beat climate change, that also serves to undermine some of these key US economic grievances against China. And I am at time, so I'm going to stop there.
Great. Next up, we'll have Joanna Lewis. And just as a quick reminder, if folks want to put questions in the Q&A section at the bottom, I will be collecting those and will pick some of them for a Q&A section at the end. So just a quick reminder to get your questions in if something comes up to you as those folks are speaking.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of this really important conversation. I'm going to speak a bit about China's energy and emissions context because, as you know, the framing for this event notes that there really is no solution to climate change without engaging China. China is 27% of global emissions, and its emissions are more than all industrialized countries combined. And so I want to lay out some of the details of China's current energy and emissions trajectory and opportunities for engaging China in this area. So, first of all, I just want to point out, China, of course, is still growing in terms of its overall energy consumption. Coal is still the dominant energy source, and we saw coal peak in about 2013, 2014, and it's now back up again last year. And so this is, the opposite trend that one was hoping to see. If you're going to be reducing emissions in China, you can't do that without decarbonizing the energy sector. And so this growing coal share is really concerning. And, the flip side of that is that new capacity going in is still predominantly clean. So while we do still see approvals of coal plants across the country, we do see really rapid growth in the clean energy technology space, particularly wind and solar. And even though there was a slight sort of adjustment in these markets, subsidies were adjusted, and then of course the economic impact of the COVID pandemic, you actually see really strong growth last year in wind and solar capacity. So that's a good sign. And of course, a lot of what China's doing is driven by the targets they set. And there have been many pledges that have been made publicly, and I want to run through a few of the most important ones. So first of all, of course, the 14th five-year plan goals are the most recent. They were released in March, and they include energy intensity, carbon intensity increases, as well as a non-fossil energy target. These are the targets that basically take you for the next 5 years through 2025. And then you have the NDC. This is, of course, the targets that China pledged in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, and they have since revised this. President Xi made remarks at the end of last year signaling that China would be revising its NDC as outlined on this slide. I should note China hasn't formally submitted their new NDC, but this is what it may look like. And so the fact that it hasn't been formally submitted also means there's some opportunity to potentially adjust, but this is what they're looking at, which is really sort of an incremental improvement on before. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then, of course, the other big goal that's looming is the carbon neutrality goal. Again, this was announced by President Xi last fall, that China intends to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. And this announcement really caught many by surprise because this is really quite ambitious. And in many ways, it's not totally clear how you get from here to there. So starting with the 14th five-year plan, if you compare what targets have been put forward to the last five-year plan, you see essentially more of the same. So you see a relatively comparable rate of carbon intensity decrease, holding steady 18%. Energy intensity slightly less ambitious, and that is in part because the goal was actually not met for the 13th five-year plan. In part due to slow economic growth. Of course, these are all targets indexed to economic growth. And so the fact that you saw slower growth last year affected their ability to meet that target. Non-fossil share of primary energy slightly more ambitious than before, going from 15 to 20%. And then, of course, you have your technology-specific goals, including, pretty aggressive goals that to ramp up nuclear, hydropower, and others are still being will come in sort of the next energy sector 5-year plan, which will be released in the coming months. So if you take these sort of near-term, 5-year goals and translate these into long-term targets, you can see, do these get China on track to an under 2-degree scenario? And in short, no. If you look at some of the modeling studies that have been put out by Tsinghua, by the China National Renewable Energy Center and others, you see that you don't have, again, in place the targets that you would need to incentivize the type of reductions to get you into these dramatic emissions reduction pathways. And, when you look at the NDC goal, of course, China had pledged back in the lead up to the Paris Agreement to peak its total emissions by the year 2030. And a lot of the modeling studies that came out after that actually showed, likely emissions would peak even before that, possibly by 2025. But to get to a 2025 peak, you would actually need a lot of sectors to peak well before that. You would have needed industrial emissions to peak already, buildings to peak maybe 2029, and again, this is because sectors like transportation are still growing very rapidly. And to allow that growth to occur over the next few years, you need other sectors to begin to contract in terms of total emissions. So if you kind of square 2030 peak with this carbon neutrality goal of 2060, essentially what a lot of the models are showing, and I should say, these models are not just academic, right? These are actually models done by key research institutes in China that directly inform the targets that policymakers set in China. One of the modeling studies I'm referring to out of Tsinghua is the group that is run by Climate Minister Xie Jinhua, who had retired and gone to work there, and then is now, of course, back as special envoy. So a lot of these models show that essentially China's emissions can be allowed to increase till 2030, maybe even 2035, in order to continue economic growth, not essentially sacrifice economic growth. And then you could still meet a 1.5 degree goal if then, after you grow until 2030, you experience a very sharp decline, 8 to 10% a year, and then achieve a 90% emissions reduction from the peak, by mid-century. So that sounds great, but this is just an extremely rapid drop off. It is an unprecedented emissions reduction. It's something China and no other country in the world has ever been able to achieve. So waiting that long, is really, it's going to be very costly and, perhaps not even possible. So, the implications of this, just sort of to sum up, right, the near-term goals China's putting forward are modest. They don't put China on track for the more ambitious long-term goals. And you still really see the country prioritizing economic growth, particularly in the wake of the post-COVID economic recovery. And the revised NDC is only an incremental improvement on the first NDC that was pledged to the Paris Agreement. I think we see, they're likely to achieve the non-fossil energy goals most certainly. And the peak year is concerning, again, because it's looking to be shifted further and further out. And if China waits until after 2030 to take more ambitious action, meaning mid-century goals that are in line with 1.5 or even 2 degree scenarios, will require unprecedented and very costly shifts. So, I really think this opens the door for many opportunities for US engagement. This is a very crucial time. And I think it's quite significant that China and US governments last month were able to sign a joint statement when Secretary Kerry visited Shanghai to really start to reinvigorate engagement. And there's a lot of really important language in there that leaves the door open for China to announce more ambitious near-term targets in particular, which I think are particularly crucial. We're likely to see a track 1 vehicle established for dialogue, but I think it's important to note that track 2 engagement still remains very critical right now because of the overall political context and the tensions between our countries. I don't think we can expect to see the same kind of US-China climate energy engagement as we saw during the Obama administration, where we had almost every US agency had multiple agreements. They were constantly signing with China, dialogues, happening almost weekly, major exchanges back and forth. I don't think we're going to see that level of engagement because of the broader tensions in the economic and security environment. And so it is really important, I think, to keep stakeholders from the academic communities, from the business communities, from the NGO and other stakeholder communities, outside of the government engaged here, particularly as sort of, the political winds change so quickly. I want to flag that there were a few strategic technology areas that were highlighted in this joint statement released last month. And some of these are areas where we already have a very robust program of US-China technology cooperation. This includes carbon capture, utilization and storage technologies, renewable energy, energy efficiency, particularly for buildings, low carbon transportation. But then you also had a few new areas that were flagged, which I think are particularly interesting because these are areas where we have not in the past had a robust agenda for engagement with China. This includes green hydrogen, so hydrogen produced sustainably, non-CO2 greenhouse gases such as methane, which China certainly, currently has not released any specific targets on how to control a lot of these non-CO2 gases, and then aviation and maritime emissions. So I think all these technology areas are important, but of course need to be navigated very carefully. I think this is a very difficult environment for science and technology engagement, given, again, a lot of the political and security concerns. That said, I don't think we should be afraid of it. I do think we have a lot of experience with navigating the complex landscape, how to manage intellectual property strategically. We did a lot of this with the US-China Clean Energy Research Center and other programs. So I think this can be navigated in a way that really optimizes US interests and still allows for this important cooperation to take place. And then another area I want to flag that's also mentioned in the joint statement is the idea that low carbon and renewable energy investment in developing countries needs to be maximized. And this is an area where I think the United States is really looking to regain its role, in part in response to the Belt and Road Initiative, as Toby mentioned earlier. And so I think this is, a really important sort of marker to put down on sort of, is this a place where the US is either going to counter China or potentially leverage Chinese investments, or work with China, right, to think about how to shift some of this browner investment towards green investment, particularly in other developing countries. And then finally, the last thing I would mention is that, we're certainly going to see expanded international pressure on China and on all countries in the lead up to COP26 at the end of this year. And this really it presents a lot of opportunities for multilateral efforts to engage China. So this doesn't just have to be bilateral. Through the G7, through the G20, there's a lot of coordination happening, a lot of other forums that will be taking place. And I think sometimes the kind of G2 lens is strategic for climate engagement, but sometimes smaller multilateral groupings can actually work better on key issues. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to the conversation in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up, Kevin Gallagher.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This is one of the most important conversations that needs to happen in the world economy. And I'll happily start by echoing what just about everyone else has already said, which is that when it comes to the provision of global public goods, the two largest and most systemically connected countries in the world have to work in parallel at minimum and together in optimum. The cost of financial crises, climate change, pandemics, and social unrest far outweigh the benefits of decoupling in a Cold War. I won't belittle the fact that the two countries have a growing number of legitimate grievances with each other, but to me, a progressive agenda for the United States is to work hard on addressing those grievances on one track and to work just as hard at providing global public goods on another. To me, a US strategy for that involves three pillars. Number one, first and foremost, is to lead by example. We lack a lot of legitimacy in this space. We have to work at the national level for domestic and foreign economic policy. that delivers growth and opportunity through a just transition to a zero carbon economy at home and abroad, as Joanna said. Number two, we have to reform global economic institutions to align them with these national goals, not just so the United States can get the right policies in place, so that all nations can. All nations have a right to a just transition, even China. And third, with those two pillars in place, there's room for healthy competition, real coordination, and even collaboration with China. It's necessary, but it's possible. It won't go very far if we don't deliver on the first two pillars. We can't solve the climate and social crises by pointing fingers at China. So let me hit each of those three really quick. Number one, the most important one in my book, is to lead by example. And the number one priority for the United States is to redirect capital away from unproductive, fossil fuel intensive, and income polarizing economic activity towards a just transition. The Biden infrastructure plan with elements of the Warren bill starts to rebuild that, but that is a very temporary, big shot in the arm. We need permanent legislation in two different ways. One, we need permanent legislation on climate change. We learned under the Obama administration that governing by executive orders isn't very strong and it doesn't last very long. As outlined in the National Academy of Sciences Deep Decarbonization Study from a couple of weeks ago, we need to permanently capitalize a green bank for the United States that can fuel industrial policies towards greener industries and play a key role in the decommissioning and adjustment toward a just transition. Behind every stranded asset is a stranded community, stranded workers, and stranded entrepreneurs. We can't leave them behind. We have to help get them to the front of the line. The second, perhaps even more important than climate legislation, is real regulation of the financial sector. Lasting regulation like the Glass-Steagall Act that the Roosevelt administration did, which lasted until the 1990s. We need permanent regulations of the financial sector that sets a real playing field for not only strict classifications for what's a green bond and what's green, but that also outlaws and phases out financing into brown sectors and rentier capitalism. U.S. companies account for 58% of the overseas institutional investing of the coal sector and 21% of all the lending of the coal sector. We've got to do a lot of work there. A key other thing for leading by example is reforming our own development finance institutions. In 2018, 2019, the United States created its own global development bank, the DFC, or the Development Finance Corporation. Biden took a step in the right direction at the climate summit, pledging that 30% of its balance sheet be climate aligned. But that said, the other 70% can't go in the wrong direction. And the DFC got off to a terrible start. In January of this year, they gave a loan to Ecuador on condition that they privatize fossil fuel state-owned companies to US companies and block all Chinese technology coming into Ecuador into the future. We should be helping Ecuador to make a just transition away from oil dependency and extractivism, not pinning them to Washington consensus kind of policies that lock in even more fossil fuel production and privatize the benefits. Here, the United States has a lot to learn from China. And I think everyone in the progressive community has to learn about the Chinese experience and not get it all from DuPont Circle. There's a narrative that China is just a bunch of cheaters, but on many levels, it's been us who's been cheated. If you think about in the early 1980s, that's when China and the United States started to integrate with the global economy and try to reform its economies. China has invested 40% of GDP annually since that period, including the most mammoth industrial policy in solar, wind, and electric battery manufacturing that has in effect subsidized a global clean technology learning to the point where clean technology is now at price parity with fossil fuels. Without China, we wouldn't have had a chance to meet our climate goals. They would have already been blown out of the water. While China invested, the United States divested and deregulated our economy. We're now down to about 22% of GDP invested in terms of investment, and obviously the majority of that is going in the wrong direction. So it shouldn't be a wonder that when one country invests 40% of GDP for 40 years and the other country divests and deregulates, that the United States gets taken out to lunch. Can you really blame that on China? Another thing that's important to understand about China is that it's going to be harder for them to do a just transition than the United States is. Their plants, as Joanna showed, are much, much newer, and there's literally tens and hundreds of millions of people and workers in these fossil fuel sectors. We have to appreciate that, which gives us even more of an impetus to need to lead by example. In addition to leading by example, as Toby said, the United States, for better or worse, sits at the top of the international financial institutions, or the Bretton Woods institutions, and they need fundamental reform to be aligned with a just transition and to make room for emerging market and developing countries, including China. Greening parts of the world will have negative consequences on others, just like closing plants in Pennsylvania or Harbin will have on workers and communities there. When we succeed in getting the United States out of oil, that's going to have major impacts on a country like Mexico, where all of their oil exports come to the United States, and revenues from oil are about 40% of the fiscal budget. The progressives desperately need a foreign economic policy strategy. In 2018 and 2019 with UNCTAD, I led a multi-stakeholder dialogue of unions, development agencies, development NGOs from the South and the North to put together what we call the Geneva Principles for a Global Green New Deal. 5 principles that should guide the fundamental reform of the international financial institutions. I'll put a link to that report in the chat. I'll only mention 2 of the principles. Number 1, that global rules should be calibrated towards the overarching goals of social and economic stability, shared prosperity, and environmental sustainability, and be protected against the capture of the most powerful players. And another one I want to highlight is that the right of states to policy space to pursue national development strategies should be enshrined in global rules. There shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. Quickly, what does this mean for the IMF and World Bank? They're going to need to fully incorporate climate risk into surveillance and advisory roles and align their financing with a just transition. Small island developing countries in the Caribbean and the Pacific have been experiencing increased incidents of natural disasters, hurricanes, et cetera, that wreak havoc on their economies. But when this happens, the IMF interprets the situation as fiscal profligacy that needs to be remedied by harsh austerity measures that halt spending and social services. A reformed IMF and World Bank will help countries design financial and fiscal systems that will prevent and mitigate climate risk and mobilize financing, both domestically and internationally, for a just transition. The international institution or network of them that needs the most reform is the trading system, the WTO, and the regional financial arrangements. On top of over $500 billion in explicit fossil fuel subsidies across the world, the fossil fuel industry receives between 500 and 800 billion a year in implicit subsidies through direct and indirect tariffs on clean production, where subsidies on industrial policy for clean production are increasingly illegal. What's more, most trade and investment treaties, especially the ones that have been pushed by both parties in the United States, have investor-state dispute systems which allow carbon majors to sue governments who put in policies for deep decarbonization. Number 1, lead by example. Number 2, reform the international economic institutions. With that in place, we can engage in healthy competition, parallel coordination, and even collaboration. A United States that's on the right path to a just transition nationally and through global leadership can lead by example and will have the legitimacy to point out and pressure countries and companies that resist these pathways to global prosperity. We can do this through healthy competition. A democratically determined just transition at home will be the best way to project US power across the world. We can also do parallel coordination. And as Joanna says, the joint statement from a couple of weeks ago shows that there's real room. An immediate first step out of this joint statement would be for the 2 countries to pledge to limit overseas coal finance. China is the largest public financier of overseas coal finance at upwards of 60% of all the publicly financed overseas coal plants, and could follow Japan and South Korea, who recently pledged to limit public financing of overseas coal. But Chinese coal plants abroad are only 17% of the total, with the United States being the largest investor and the 2nd largest lender of overseas coal plants. The United States could act in parallel and put limit on US commercial interests for overseas coal. Such first steps could lay the groundwork for parallel efforts on oil, on gas, and beyond into the future. Similarly, I'll put it in the chat, I don't have time to get to it, but we've proposed a debt relief for a green and inclusive recovery proposal. And if you look at the global debt profile around the world, A lot of countries are in debt distress with China, but even more with private bondholders with most of the contracts in New York. The United States could lean on the private sector in the United States to not only renegotiate debts with the emerging market countries, but to do debt for climate swaps. And if the United States did that on their end, China could act on the other side. And we should actually collaborate with the Chinese. We may be far away from the Development Finance Corporation and the China Development Bank working together on this right away. But as Joanna said, we can do so through multilateral institutions. 2 years ago, and the Chinese are willing to do this. 2 years ago, the Chinese were in discussions with one of the prominent US multilateral development banks to create what's called a triangular cooperation for clean energy finance. Chinese, who have more capital that they're willing to put in this place, we're going to put up a lot of capital and their technological know-how on clean energy manufacturing. The US-led development bank was going to provide credit enhancement because our banks are cheaper and have more experience in a particular region. And they're also going to work with national development banks in the region who know the projects better and know the local projects together. This was going to be triangular cooperation on clean energy transitions in a particular region in the world. Unfortunately, when Mike Pence's office got wind of this scheme, he put a kibosh on it and canceled it out. And unfortunately, the Menendez, what I'd call the Cold War legislation that's going through Congress right now, would bake in these kind of Mike Pence policies rather than get rid of them. The world can't afford another Cold War. Let's throw cold water on it and lead by example rather than leading by fear and by failure. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Finally, we will hear from Tim.
Oh, sorry. Thanks so much, Kevin. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, cool. I fully support the call to end global warming by throwing cold water in the Cold War. It's a great line. Let me just move to presentation mode. Sorry, can everyone see that?
No, the screen share is not working right now.
Oh, it's not? Sorry. Is it working now?
Yep.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, so for US and China to cooperate, we need to sort of think about both our security relationship and our trade and investment relationship. It can't just be seen as foreign policy on one side, energy policy on another side, domestic policy on another side. We really have to integrate all of these viewpoints together. The United States and China are the world's largest producers of oil and gas and coal. The world does not have time to waste in a new Cold War. We already have seen with the COVID pandemic how ecological destruction and habitat destruction can cause a virus to leap out of the wild places on the planet or from agribusinesses and charge out worldwide and change an entire planet. This is not the only sort of tipping points that we have unleashed. There are tipping points in the Arctic, there are tipping points in the permafrost, in the Greenland ice sheet, in the boreal forests of the northern lands, in the Amazon rainforest, in the West Antarctic ice sheet, where you can have glaciers very rapidly collapsing, causing rapid sea level rise in the second half of the 21st century. And each of these tipping points can sort of a century of crises that we have to be prepared for. And we can't have the world's two largest fossil fuel superpowers at each other's necks. We need to learn how to cooperate and manage the Anthropocene that we have collectively unleashed. The thing that makes the United States and China somewhat similar and somewhat different is that one of them is a coal power. China is the world's largest producer of coal, and the other is an oil power. The United States is the world's largest oil and gas producer. This makes sort of headlines in newspapers really puzzling, Because on the one hand, we hear a lot about China as being the world's largest coal emitter, which it is. And on the other hand, we hear a lot about the United States as fracking and drilling and turning into the world's largest oil producer. But there's a way in which you can sort of think about both of these things together, that they are powerful fossil fuel powers, while at the same time, they are acutely vulnerable to climate shocks, and they're acutely vulnerable to ecological problems within the state. China in particular is an electro state in the sense that the entire electrification program for the last 4 or 5 decades has been led by the state. That's why there are so many coal power plants. That's why it's sort of an all of the above energy strategy. It is also an oil and gas importer. It's a coal-rich state, but an oil-poor state, which means that it is dependent upon importing oil and gas from the Middle East, from Australia, from Qatar, which makes it extremely vulnerable to US naval blockades, which is the explicit sort of war strategy of the Pentagon. So it gives this a flavor of sort of energy security, which people here in the US are very familiar with. We were terrified of losing access to oil and gas in the 1973 oil crisis, and we embarked upon a massive coal boom in the 1970s that is only being unwound in the 2010s. Climate disasters have been mounting in China. The CCP has been sort of suppressing reports of the enormous amount of flooding that happens every year. But basically, there has been a forced space pattern of urbanization with very rapid city building in the last 2 or 3 decades. And that basically means the creation of large mega cities that are caked in concrete. And that forced space urbanization just means you're going to get more flooding. That's the flip side of it. And you're going to get more flooding in farms, in cities, in factories that then reduce the country's future growth prospects. Like China, the US too is ecologically vulnerable, as we have seen last year with the spate of climate disasters, but this is just something that's been ongoing. We had massive fires in the West. We had a large number of hurricanes strike the Gulf Coast. We've had flooding on the East. And these are just sort of disasters that are going to continue on in the 21st century unless we can find a way to get off carbon and go green. The solution in both countries has been to launch a green investment boom on the one hand, and on the other, to expand the welfare state, as Kevin and Joanna were talking about earlier. You need to deal with the fact that a lot of industries and cities and factories are going to get stranded. People are going to lose jobs in the fossil fuel sector, and they need to be supported towards a transition to the fast growing green sectors. And that's going to require an expanded welfare state, which is unemployment, social security benefits, and so on. And both the US and China are sort of in the process of enlarging their welfare state. China, because it has a very poor welfare state, and the US, because it has been busy cutting back its welfare state over the past few decades. But that's sort of the goal of the Green New Deal movement, is to do both, to dramatically expand green technologies and energy, and to expand the welfare state. So basically, the points that I wanted to make were these: that a new climate progressivism must support not just an energy transition domestically, but globally, because there's a joint crisis of climate and inequality in every country. The US and China are both extremely unequal countries whose inequality has only increased in the last 3 or 4 decades. Time is of the essence. This is not going to happen in the year 2050 and the year 2100. This transition has to happen extremely rapidly, because the world cannot afford another doubling of CO2, which is slated to happen in the next 30 years if we continue on our current path of fossil fuel growth. But the good news is that the solution that both of these countries have found, and Europe has found, and pretty much every country has found, is to sustain a high investment economy over the next few decades, with most of that investment going towards buildings, energies, cities, and so on to go green as quickly as possible. The similarity is sweeping industrial policy to dramatically boost productivity, to reduce inequality, to get a whole bunch of jobs in the green sector, and to make the big investments in the social safety net that I was talking about earlier. The third is climate progressives must sort of realize that this sort of climate stick is going to whack countries everywhere. It doesn't matter whether you are poor or rich in the global north or global south. This is going to be reducing growth prospects of every country everywhere. But the key idea that is sort of framing the next a couple of decades is that the green transition must be stable. It must be anchored by a coalition of social democratic forces inside a country, but it should also have a way in which a country can rethink of its security as framed by the climate as well, not just trying to be rich and powerful and preventing other countries from attacking you, but also to reduce the magnitude of climate disasters. And to do that, like Biden in the United States has launched a program of green infrastructure and green investment, but that's not enough. He's been sort of saying that exactly what Kevin was saying, that you need to change finance, you need to change security aims, you need to change the way in which you deal with other countries. So all of it has to be coordinated by each instrument of state power. So the departments of Treasury, State, Commerce, Agriculture, all of them have to redirect their efforts towards decarbonization. And Biden administration, we have seen that kind of rhetoric from him in China too, with Xi's climate neutrality announcement that China is going to go completely climate neutral by 2060, which also requires a very coordinated effort by each arm of the state. China sort of started doing this after the 2008 crash and launched an immense program of green investment where low carbon energy technologies were given a huge amount of state support with cooperation from Western firms. This sort of cooperation and scaling up dramatically reduced costs of these low carbon energy technologies, and it enabled other countries to start going green as well. So you could think of a country like India, which doesn't produce as many solar panels domestically, but was able to import these cheaper Chinese-made solar panels and embark on a solar boom. So this global green industrial revolution has to be sort of sustained inside every country, but in China, it has been so dramatic because of global cooperation. It's not something that China sort of did by itself. It took help from German firms, French firms, Japanese firms, American firms, and so on. So over the last 3 years, it's not just China that has joined on to this green investment boom, but also the United States and Germany, which together are the top 3 producers and manufacturers of the key technologies that will enable us to go green. So they are the top 3 in electric cars, in wind, in solar, in hydro. China has about 300 gigawatts of hydropower domestically, but has also launched on an export campaign with Sino Hydro exporting and building dams in dozens and dozens of other countries. And hydropower is sort of a key source of constant power that merges well with other renewables and allows for fossil fuel grids to go green quicker. The problem is that the electric car, while building these green technologies, we have also been building sort of fossil fuel technologies. So the key effort right now is to sort of I'm sort of on the wrong slide. Sorry, I'll just go back to the transport slide. So China has been producing about half of the world's EVs. The United States is number 2, and Europe is quickly catching up. Again, these are firms that have manufacturing and design in one country, scaling up in another country. So this is already extremely cooperative, but we really need to expand that level of cooperation. On electric buses, China had basically 0 electric buses before the 2008 crash, but chose electric buses as a key technology, and pretty much 99% of all the world's electric buses are now in China, but there's no reason why the US and Europe can't replicate this after the Corona crisis. On trains, China too, after 2008, dramatically expanded trains, which allows for people to not fly between cities. So you can do long distance train travel, and you can sort of think of a counterfactual world where if China hadn't embarked upon a program of high-speed trains, then people would have bought a lot more cars and would have done a lot more flying. And this is again a massively cooperative effort where high-speed trains was a result of technology transfer between China's state-owned firms, Siemens, Alstom, Bombardier, Kawasaki from Japan. And this is just an example of how high investment targeted towards certain sectors can bring down the cost of a technology and then can allow for exports and for other countries to also import high-speed trains. So what should a new climate progressivism sort of think about from a strategic point of view? You have to win domestically and defeat fossil fuel forces domestically, but that requires you to combat, in the case of US, we have a very hard time combating Republicans who have been supporting the expanding of oil and gas production. So we have a Koch brother problem. China doesn't have a single Koch brother problem. China has 100 Koch brothers problem, because there are loads and loads of cities and provinces that are locked into a pattern of high carbon investment into coal power plants and into concrete-based real estate booms. And so these interests exist in every country. They have to be outmaneuvered by the growing green interests. And this sort of very delicate balance of power inside every country between green interests and fossil interests creates problems. It creates problems where if we have if we sort of completely de-link domestic policy from foreign policy, what we basically end up doing is that the domestic struggle between fossil and green interests are shaped by what other countries are doing from outside. So if the US is doing a campaign on decoupling with China, it reduces the relative power of the green export interests inside China that are then, they then lose out to the fossil interests domestically. So that is one of the reasons, as Devita was sort of saying, we need to sort of change the global trade regime to allow for free trade of green goods rather than blocking export of Chinese goods, because it would upset the domestic balance of power within China, which is extremely delicate. So the Cold War sort of military posture of the Western powers increases the relative power of the heavy industry interests inside China compared to the green interests. And the heavy industry interests, which are coal and steel primarily, they basically argue that a US campaign of blocking oil from being imported into China can only be countered by producing more domestic coal. And so that's sort of one very direct way in which the Cold War leads China to get locked on to a path of more carbon intensive. I mean, that's one element. And the second element is if China does feel threatened militarily, it's going to embark upon an arms race. And an arms race is just going to be a heavy metal, heavy industrial buildup, and it would crash the planet. And the goal for progressives has to be to cool down the temperature of that arms race. And therefore, we have to sort of point to a green detente as sort of the paramount interests for stability of the planet. And it should be the goal of national security as well. With that, I'll bring that to a close. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, Well, I've learned a lot in the last little while. So thank you everyone for, for all of that. I mean, one thing that really stands out to me is just how much more information we have after the last set of presentations than I think ever really comes across in sort of mainstream discussions about China and the US, where you would sort of get this image that China is a sort of monolithic country without internal politics, without industries, without, democratic movements, without labor movements, right? And all of that exists, right? China is a country with competing movements. And, I think the focus of this panel is really to think about what US engagement with China looks like. And of course, we have our own sort of internal movements and interest in industries, as Tim was getting at. And one thing that I've been sort of tracking as a reporter is just, we have seen this huge shift, right, in the last several months. I mean, really since the Democratic primary, and things were changing a bit before that, in the way climate change is talked about in particular, right, and really being people like Joe Biden, hardly sort of historically progressive actors, being willing to consider, big green investment, even if sort of what's on the table right now is not as big as we might hope it to be. But that there has been this shift, right? And, the increasing influence of groups like the Sunrise Movement, Alexander Ocasio-Cortez have shifted that conversation. And, we have sort of progressive appointments to things like the Department of Energy. And, there are people who I think would share probably some of the aims that we have on this call, filling out different parts of the administration. There seems to be room to push there. One thing that, I'm working my way to a question about this, but that seems like there's less of a give is with foreign policy. And there has been this, core, right? I think Stephen Walt calls it the blob within the sort of foreign policy national security establishment, which has been pushing fairly hawkish aims, supporting many of the things that Trump was pushing with regard to foreign policy, with regard to China in particular, saying we want to do that in a slightly different way, sort of bringing in more multinational partners through, organizations like the Quad to make confronting China sort of multilateral project as opposed to a unilateral project under Trump. And there's just, it seems like there's a harder core, right, of personnel within the administration around foreign policy, and an increasing sort of bipartisan interest in very hawkish Cold War type policies from people like Bob Menendez, right? There's a bill advancing from Chuck Schumer along slightly similar lines, with some more redeeming elements, which we can talk about. But that seems like the harder nut to crack. At the same time, we've had a big victory, right, on foreign policy recently with Catherine Tai, U.S. Trade Representative, agreeing to support a waiver of intellectual property rights under the World Trade Organization's TRIPS waiver, which Toby mentioned. So, one thing I'm wondering across these presentations, and we just put to the panel, is what does it look like to kind of mobilize like bottom-up forces around this? And when we think of sort of climate diplomacy and foreign policy in general, it's sort of province of high-minded diplomats and people sort of who exist in international institutions and globetrot around to different meetings. But it seems like the kind of foreign policy elite is not necessarily on the verge of enlightenment by virtue of going to enough meetings or listening to enough reading enough PDFs, right? And that there needs to be some sort of bottom-up push in the way that there was some victory, right, on the TRIPS waiver. So I'd be curious kind of what it looks like to sort of, what your thoughts are on mobilizing kind of domestic forces to start pushing that conversation in the way that the climate conversation really has moved along, but has not started to really articulate a kind of internationalist vision in the way that it's articulated a sort of investment-based approach, a kind of more egalitarian, justice-based approach to climate policy. So what is translating that into, getting many of the things that folks have laid out here, just how do we get there, right? is the broad question. So whoever wants to kick us off. Or I'll pick someone. I will pick Toby.
I can start. Yeah. So I think we need to attack this bipartisan anti-China consensus from a variety of angles and start to like connect the dots in terms of how it impacts just a wide variety of issues in order to build like a more robust coalition. So a bunch of people have mentioned this Menendez bill, which is the Strategic Competition Act, really dangerously anti-China bill that commits the US to sort of a path towards Cold War style containment and confrontation, really dangerous stuff. It's since like just, I think it was just this week that it got combined with a bunch of other bills. So like in the Senate, Democrats and Republicans, they've thrown everything in the kitchen sink in terms of their anti-China toolkit into this one massive bill. It's now like 1,500 pages. It's called the Innovation and Competitive Act now. Justice is Global, we're also part of assembling a coalition to issue a statement opposing then the Strategic Competition Act. Now it's the Innovation and Competitiveness Act. And that brought together foreign policy and peace organizations, Asian American organizations, multi-issue progressive groups. Sunrise signed on. There are also some groups working on like different regions in Asia, like issues in Korea and Burma. There's this whole angle about how all these countries in the global south are getting caught in the middle of this US-China conflict in a way that is not in the interests of the people there. So like groups that like recognize that can also be part of this coalition. All these different groups have like different reasons why they are deeply concerned about these escalating US-China tensions. And if we can connect the dots between all of them, we can start to build a united front and attack this stuff from a bunch of different angles, right? So one angle is groups opposed to militarism and increased defense spending and war, right? So those groups have a very clear interest in fighting against this stuff. Climate, we've been talking this whole time, groups concerned about climate have that interest in fighting against this stuff. And then there's the whole angle of how anti-China nationalism is feeding into this rise of anti-Asian racism. This is a really key angle for progressives to use to attack this stuff. And groups that sort of can see an interest in this from all these different directions, together we can start to pull together a coalition that can sort of coordinate efforts to oppose the bad and also propose positive alternatives. And when it comes to proposing positive alternatives, like we've been talking about this whole time, I think climate politics, global climate politics, is a really key place to start pushing for, like, to put down a marker and say, like, here is our positive vision of what the US-China relationship needs to look like in order to meet the shared global challenge of the climate crisis. And I think just based on this recent progress around the TRIPS waiver for COVID vaccine patents, I think we can look to that campaign and draw some lessons about how to build the kind of power we need, build the coalitions we need in order to actually push for positive change in the US government.
I'll just echo and underscore what you said, Kate, that progressives working for a Green New Deal in the United States have to have a real focus on US foreign policy, especially US foreign economic policy. And like you said, the USTR is off to a great start, but they really need our help. They have an incredible group of team in there. And the president has given them space to say, we're not going to do any new trade agreements. The US economy gets better. Then we lose our trade promotion authority, which gives us a lot of space. But with the midterms and with certain members of Congress, there's going to be an itch to do new trade deals. And progressives have been very good at mobilizing against all the bad trade deals that the Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama teams have been parading through. We haven't been so successful in stopping them, but haven't had an alternative. And we need an alternative that gives the United States the policy space for structural change, just transition industrial policy, massive investments, and that allows the rest of the world to do it in a way that doesn't cause bigger than neighbor policies and doesn't make one country's actions limit the ability of another country to do it. And that's real hard work. And even the good people in the administration don't have the time to do that work. They're fighting a fire every single day. They're under pressure from some of these other hawks in the administration. It's really the job of think tanks, social movements, academics to come up with what some of these plans need to be. A wild card is the Treasury. The Treasury is pretty hollow. They have a lot of people at the top, but they haven't filled in hardly any of the most important positions. This is going to be key to a Green New Deal in the United States, because this is where they're the ones who are going to make all the economic policy, and on reforming the IMF, the World Bank, and other parts. And so we've got to keep an eye on these appointments, and again, put alternatives out there and have core pressure. It's a fundamental importance for every one webinar we have on how to make sure that there's a just transition and people who lose their jobs in Texas are put to the front of the line rather than being left behind. We have to think about that on a global level. And what we want to do in the United States is illegal under much of our trade and investment treaties. We need to reform that for ourselves and for the rest of the world.
Can I just jump in briefly on the foreign policy angle and also just sort of the political realism in Washington? You know, there's been some questions on that, of the kind of things we're talking about. You know, I think that there's a lot being done by the Biden administration team on foreign policy to elevate climate change that is sort of are things that are below the radar, and like we're not necessarily seeing the full impact of them yet, but I think are very important in terms of messaging, you know, to the rest of the world. I mean, the first high-level U.S. official to go to China was Secretary Kerry, you know, Special Envoy Kerry on climate. I mean, that just has not happened in a long time. And I think that sends a really important signal to China, to our allies, to others about where this issue lies. And I think, you know, and Kerry's position alone, right? The fact that this is this new position linking National Security Council at the White House and State Department. I mean, that has not existed previously, and really sets us up to do a lot of the engagement that you all are sort of saying, you know, we would like to kind of see happen in terms of action. You know, the first leader level summit, right, called by this administration, again, was on climate on Earth Day. I mean, this is not insignificant that, you know, Biden sort of used his political leverage to bring together all these leaders. And it wasn't about the pandemic, you know, for the most part, it was about kind of forward thinking on climate. And, you know, of course, you have this mandate now, all US agencies have to be, you know, submitting plans for how climate change is going to be strategically implemented in their work, including defense, including intelligence, homeland security, right, across the board. And so, you know, some of this is just on paper, but again, like, I think this really sets the stage for doing this much more holistic thinking about climate. I mean, climate until recently has been sort of the territory of the EPA and maybe a little DOE, a little, right? But like, this is a very different approach, I think. And again, you know, we talk about the sort of all of the government approach, and some of this is just sort of symbolic, but I actually think that's what you need, right? To think about how do you link the trade policy with the economic policy, with the pollution policy, you know, the justice policy, all these things. And you can't do that without this whole government approach.
Great. Thank you all so much. Tim, did you have something you wanted to add?
No, I think I'll come back to it.
Cool. All right, well, I want to make sure we get to a couple questions for our audience. I'll also try to combine, I think, a couple things that were popping up in the chat. So I'm going to try to do that again and like amalgamate a question together. One thing that's come up a lot is, you know, sort of this balance between, you know, U.S. green industrial policy, right, and trying to, you know, do the sort of work at home to make sure that the U.S. is meeting its climate commitment, which, as Kevin mentioned, is one of the most important things the U.S. can do, right? Is just showing a good faith effort within our own borders, right, to meet this challenge. And it seems like there's a careful line, right, of doing, embarking on that project, embarking on this like massive sort of build up of green technology that we need to do, investing in research and innovation, bringing down our own fossil fuel emissions. And, the US has not historically been very good at doing these sorts of big transformations without creating or fighting some foreign enemy. That is, a through line of US policies, that we do big things with an enemy abroad, right? And that seems like a sort of dangerous path in where we are now. But I'm just curious how folks in the panel sort of think about that question, right? Is there sort of a model of productive competition, right? Toby mentioned, that there is this sort of like inkling of something slightly positive, right? In efforts like vaccinating, sending out 1 billion vaccinations, not a bad thing. Is there something there worth pursuing, and sort of how do you think about that tension, and kind of what is there a threshold to say, this is getting too dangerous, this is, we're sort of pushing well into the realm of the Cold War. So there's I'm just curious how you all think about that. And maybe Tim, if you want to start.
Yeah, I think the idea of the race is the clean energy race is the dominating sort of metaphor that you hear from Biden or from Secretary Yellen. And it basically says, well, we need to go full blast on a domestic investment and pick certain sectors like offshore wind. And in particular, the US has, technologically advanced companies on wind, while China has dominated solar. So there is sort of a lot of room for sort of picking sectors where you could drive down the cost curve very rapidly. And that is definitely sort of one way to where the metaphor of the race does make sense. Another way it makes sense is there are sectors that we simply haven't done enough R&D on, or have done the R&D on, but haven't deployed it enough to actually bring it down. So, you could think about green steel as something that were the US and Europe to jointly push out green steel very rapidly in the next 5 or 10 years, that could be something that China needs because it has the world's largest sort of steel blast furnaces. So there are ways in which the framing of a race does make sense. The question that you asked is there a threshold where it goes nasty? And I think the way it goes bad is the way in which we are looking at US sanctions on Chinese oil companies. And as soon as you start to sort of sanction oil companies like PetroChina and Sinopec and so on for activities in the South China Seas, that's when China kind of moves towards and says, you know what, we're going to make oil out of coal. We're going to make gas out of coal. And so that is the dangerous line where it would dramatically entrench Chinese heavy industry were the US to use the means of sanctions.
If I could jump in, because I have to leave it in a couple of minutes, I'm so sorry. I'm an economist, and I think competition is a very good thing. And competition was a core part of the original New Deal. This country is so divided. To have something that unifies us, a national project of leading by example to get more equality in the United States, to green our economy, to get towards a just transition is a unifying thing. And if we feel like other countries are beating us to it, then let's unite. I liked the way President Biden framed it in his speech. He's much better than a lot of the hawks in his administration. He framed it around that. I think the fear is, the problem is there's so many forces that don't want to unite around a national project, that would rather unite around just maintaining the status quo, building up massive military and getting engaged in military conflicts and building up there. I've got enough gray hair. I remember, how that hollowed out the entire industrial system in the United States. So that is what we cannot afford. And I just don't trust the leadership, especially the China specialists that are out there on steering us in the right direction. I like the the way Biden went to it. And I think that's our job as those of us working in democracy building and being, talking heads and things like that, is that we need a national project. And we're losing the competition in it on democracy, on infrastructure, on climate change, and on justice. And we got a lot of work to do here. Let's work together on it. And if we need to use the fact that we're losing so badly to unite us, that's a great thing. But let's make sure that we channel it towards the project and not towards war and fear.
Okay, so I think I might have a different perspective on this. So as a general policy, I don't talk about competition with China as a force for good. I think that the dominant framework has fallen so far into zero-sum competition and this notion that if China succeeds, the US is going to lose. And in order for the US to succeed, China has to lose. I think that's very dangerous. And I think when US leaders talk about that, it gets sold under this veneer of like concern for the US working class very often. And I think that's kind of a con. When US leaders talk about needing to maintain the US as the number one, we need to win the economy of the 21st century, blah, blah, blah. What they're really talking about is maintaining the power and profit of US corporations, particularly against Chinese rivals. So this is an issue of competition between like these top corporations, right? So the US wants US clean energy corporations to beat clean energy corporations in China. And it's about these corporate interests. In terms of working class interests, like, and this came up in some of the questions in the Q&A, there's this illusion that the US needs to compete with China over green jobs, as if there's a finite and limited number of jobs to be created in the global green economy, and we need to make sure that the US gets as much as possible and that China gets fewer of them. I think that's just completely unhinged. We are not at a loss for work that needs to be done to deal with climate change. We can create as many green jobs as we want, and we should, if we just like put the capital into it. There's more than enough work to go around. We can create all the green jobs that we need in the US, in China, and all around the world. We don't need to have this mindset of competing over green jobs, which then serves as cover for this great power, like corporate competition that I think a lot of our leaders are committed to.
I know we're over time, so I'll just really quickly add, I think the way I think about this is, if competition with China mobilizes a domestic response here in the US or in the EU or elsewhere, then great, because no matter whether we like how China got there, they're winning. And we're running out of time for a global transition to low carbon energy technologies. And right now, the way our global value chains are set up for these technologies, we cannot get there without China's manufacturing power, without the cost declines that China has been able to bring about in solar and wind and hydro and many other technologies we need. That's not to say there's, not important ways that, US companies can re-inject themselves into key parts of the global value chain, and many are, and many are, I think, have really strategic advantages in a lot of these technologies. But, I don't think it's fair to say China's not sort of paying their weight. Someone mentioned, China is now number 2 to the US in global R&D. And it's and increasing quickly, and clean energy innovation and clean energy R&D, these are all the metrics are just up and up and up. So, I think this is an opportunity for the US. I think we should think of this as an opportunity how we can leverage, whether it's the race or the competitiveness angle to really mobilize what we're doing here, but then also capitalize on China's experience, and not just push it aside.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for closing out in such a strong way. I mean, I think the idea of cooperation has just really shone through this panel today. I've learned so much, and an enormous amount, and just hearing from each of the panelists in different ways, thinking about what is a cooperative form of engagement, understanding that China's massive advances in green industrial policy have always still involved investments in technologies from other places, and thinking about the huge benefits of a kind of complementarity approach to global climate action rather than just a uniquely competitive one. And I think Kevin brought up the idea of healthy competition, and we can get into nuance and words, but a big theme here, I think, has been the massive upshot of a cooperative engagement going forward and building on some elements of that so far. I think this conversation could have gone on for hours. I hope that it will go on for days, weeks, months, years. One part of that will be the Global Green New Deal kind of online portfolio that we'll be releasing. We'll be able to go into depth with each one of these panelists with edited and transcribed interviews with all of them. Of course, these videos will be available for your perusal as long as the internet is around. We'll have podcast content. I want to note, that we think for a couple of years we had Green New Deal conversations mostly focused on domestic politics in the United States. And I know Kate and I have been a part of that. And I think this is really a chance to level up. We have to have a much more substantial, sophisticated global conversation within the Green New Deal movement. And that means talking, of course, to folks who do not necessarily see themselves as Green New Dealers. So I think that's really essential. And then last, I just want to raise a point that I think Joanna raised earlier, which is that climate has become, if anything, the leading factor for global cooperation. So there's a kind of like a tail wagging the dog potential moment here, where also the dog realizes that it was the climate dog all along. But for a long time, the climate folks, we were having this discussion at the back of the room in the corner, kind of ignored and marginalized. And now the climate and economy connection is seen so strongly and so universally that those of us in the climate justice movement, Green New Deal movement, however you want to call it, I think really do have a responsibility to kind of level up our game and to be part of these global and domestic conversations and connecting them. Okay, so huge thanks to our brilliant panelists. Again, we are going to keep this conversation going. And thank you as well to the staff who've made this event possible, the series possible. Thank you in particular to Emma Glasser, this panel series' chief researcher, to Shannon Crane, and to Anita Lai, who've helped on support. Big thanks to Perry Worldhouse for being the lead funder of this Global Green New Deal series, to my fellow organizers in the series, Kate, Thea, and Billy, and to, in addition to Perry Worldhouse, SC2, McCarg, and Penn's Pop Study Center for sponsoring this. So huge thanks to all of you. Excited to keep the conversation going, and we'll see you all again, I hope, very soon. Take care. Thank you all.